Hey there, this is Phil Fisher. Welcome back to the show. I am here with Sky Jitani.
Hi, Phil.
Who is typing on his phone.
I'm looking up this guy.
Oh, okay. That's good.
This guy who shall not be named.
As long as it's podcast related.
It is. This is podcast business.
Your phone. If you're talking to your wife about what you need to buy at Costco after this, then not so much.
Now I got to ring the bell.
Sky is here. Christian Taylor is not here. We've got more of a inside baseball sort of conversation with our guest today, so it's just Sky and me. Sky, I was going to say Sky and I, because that rhymes.
It does, but it's not proper
English.
Proper.
But is the king and I proper?
I don't think it is.
And that's just okay.
It's
no
just
one
supposed to be the king and me.
The king and me, yeah. But that doesn't sound very fancy.
No.
I say it's the king and I.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah. We're going to do British accents the whole day.
Yes, maybe have fun with Justin. Okay, I'm going to sing. Hey, it's a podcast. What do you know? Hey, it's a podcast. And we got video. Hey, it's a podcast. So lend an ear. The Phil Fisher podcast starts right here. Oh, we'll talk to Sky, but not Christian too, because she's not here. But we got a guest for you. All the way from across the pond. Hey, it's a podcast. So lend an ear. The Phil Fisher podcast starts right here. The Phil Fisher podcast starts right here. Do they have the ukulele in the UK?
Yes, we do have ukuleles.
That's good.
But no one plays it as well as you. So.
Well, that probably goes without saying.
And I've never heard it on a radio show or podcast.
Right, it's underappreciated. Although it's become kind of hipster for folk music and such.
Yeah,
you know, it's
you need a man bun and a beard.
I need a man bun and a beard. Yeah, and much heavier glasses, horn-rimmed glasses.
Right.
Yeah.
I've seen the odd ukulele pop up in church services.
Really?
Worship band.
Really?
But it tends to be more mandolins if you're going for small style guitars.
Right.
But I have seen them incorporated into one or two workshops.
I have seen a mandolin with kind of a monastic thing, but the ukulele is more
Monasticalin?
monastic mandolin.
Monastic mandolin. We should do a whole album of monastic mandolin.
If you play the ukulele long enough, and you may find yourself in a monastic life.
Yes, or at least experiencing God more fully and deeply.
And alone.
And alone.
Right.
Which is as Jesus went out for 40 days with his ukulele in the wilderness.
Yes.
Do you know what percentage of the Psalms were composed for ukulele? Would be your guess?
Well, all the ones that say Selah, that means ukulele in Hebrew.
That's the Hebrew for ukulele.
Yeah.
Okay, our guest is Justin Brierley. Are you in London? Do you live in London?
I live just outside London in a town called Woking, but it's Commutersville for London. Basically.
He lives in London, Commutersville. He is the host of the popular podcast Unbelievable. I have to say the question mark.
You got to raise your
Unbelievable.
Right.
Is it unbelievable?
That's right.
Or isn't
it? You should really raise your
yeah, you should, but you don't.
Raise it. It's a question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a question. But when you say it, you don't do that.
And what's the theme song? What's that 80s song?
It's by EMF, who were kind of a 90s band.
90s, that's
and
right.
they had a hit with that song, You're Unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
I've been using that for 10 years, and I've sometimes considered changing it, but it's kind of stuck now. So
yeah.
Part of the brand.
You changed your theme music, didn't you, Phil? You changed yours.
Yeah, we did. Because the music I was using first was just something I grabbed for free off of Apple Loops. And then people were saying, hey, I heard your theme music on this other podcast. I was like, okay, we probably need to do something a little more unique. Justin Brierley is the host of the Unbelievable podcast in the UK, which you can also get on iTunes. It is largely an apologetics podcast, but really a podcast where you just like to see people fight.
Yes, that's the idea.
But it's very civil usually.
It's usually very civil. And some episodes do get quite feisty, and people kind of have a little bit of a rant. But by and large, it's actually quite civil dialogue. And it started out as a radio show. It became a podcast a couple of years in, so we've probably got getting on for 8 or 9 years worth of podcasts in the back catalogue.
How many episodes?
Well, I worked out actually that in terms of podcast episodes, we'll be coming up on the 500th episode in November.
Whoa.
So that's going to be a big one. So yeah, in theory, you've got pretty much 500 episodes to choose from in the back catalogue.
Are you going to do anything special for the 500th, or is it not something anyone's aware of?
I made a special deal of it, the 10-year anniversary at the end of last year. So I think I'll just mention it's the 500th episode, and but we'll have whatever's on for that week for that one.
Justin is also the editor of Premier Christianity magazine, senior editor, not junior, senior. So you can fire the junior editor.
Yeah, absolutely.
When he or she displeases you.
The reason I'm the senior editor is because when I began, we also had an associate editor and a deputy editor. And then the associate editor moved on.
Yeah.
I retained, so I could have just become the editor at that point, but I retained the title senior editor. It sounds a little bit highfalutin.
How long has it been published?
Well, it's actually been going longer than our radio station. We did a 50th anniversary edition last year of the magazine, and that depends on the lineage you trace it back through. So it's, as many of these magazines are, it merged with other magazines over the years. But if you go back to its earliest incarnation, it was a magazine called Buzz.
Buzz?
Buzz magazine.
Interesting. That doesn't sound like 50 years ago.
That started in 1965 and was very much coming in as a youth Christian music magazine on the heels of the coffee bar scene and all the kind of beat combo bands that were kind of doing the rounds. Kind of around the time of the Jesus movement and that kind of stuff. What was happening over on the west coast of the USA was also kind of happening a little bit in the UK, and so it started like that and gradually evolved into a more kind of mainstream Christian publication, but still with quite a fresh feel.
Are there any British Christian artists from the first few years of Buzz magazine that are still active today?
Still doing the rounds.
That anyone would have heard of?
Well, you must have heard of Cliff Richards, right?
Yes.
Okay, so he's a Christian, and
yes.
he's not primarily a CCM artist or anything, but he's been on the pages of Buzz since the year dot, and we still cover what he does today. So 50 years on, he's had a pretty long career. But in terms of Christian artists, very few, hardly any I can really think of that are still active in a serious way.
It's a hard way to make a living.
We looked at, so it was fun going through the back catalogues for this 50th anniversary because we've got all the archives in our basement. And from the point at which, for instance, U2 started appearing on the scene, they were being charted and they were coming up in the news. And funnily enough, the magazine we've just signed off last week, our October edition, is chronicling 40 years of U2, because believe it or not, they'll have been around 40 years at the end of this month.
Wow.
Since they first formed. So.
Yeah, you'd mentioned that U2 was on the cover this month. So it's basically the equivalent of Christianity Today
very much.
The U.S., but started a little more of a CCM magazine or a campus life.
Exactly, and as I say, it did merge with other titles over the years. It kind of, at one point, it got very serious and called itself 21st Century Christian, which immediately makes it dated, unfortunately. So they dropped that title about after 3 years. And it took other names. Eventually it became Christianity Magazine, and then it had a rebrand a few years ago to bring it in line with the organisation that I'm part of, Premier Christian Radio, Premier Media, which so it's Premier Christianity Magazine, which kind of unfortunately can make it sound like we think we're the best Christianity magazine.
We are the best.
Well, how many other Christian magazines are there in the UK?
Well, they're not that many, if I'm honest. I mean, there are kind of weekly denominational magazines. Unfortunately, a lot of them have been closing down over the last several years. I think a lot of it is pressure from the internet. People can get their news that way.
Right.
Just people don't tend to subscribe to print as much as they used to, and I think that has hit some of their subscriber bases, and simply that some of the major denominations have seen their own, congregations falling anyway.
Right.
We're in the fortunate position as a magazine of actually we seem to have managed to strike some magic formula which has seen us actually increasing our subscriber base, which is great. But
wow,
as it stands, there aren't a massive number of Christian publications.
Well, you're probably in some way, but not perversely benefiting from the closure of other magazines and people then going to yours. But you're smart enough to have a diverse media platform because you're on radio, you're doing podcasts, and that probably helps as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that's part of the strength of it being part of Premier.
And do you know what else he's doing? Do you know what else Justin is doing?
He's on the Phil Vischer podcast.
No, well, yes, but no.
Numbers will go through the roof.
Yeah, no. Well, although the last time you were on, we got you a few new listeners.
Yeah,
I know.
I did.
It came up. It came up, and I think I don't know if
You got the bump?
Yeah, the pimple. It's the
Oh, that's right. The
it's
Phil Vischer
Phil
pimple.
Vischer pimple. It's the Stephen Colbert bump. He also is hosting. Was this the second year you did the apologetics conference, or the third year?
Actually, this was our 5th year.
No. I'm
we
not
did.
paying attention.
We did. So Unbelievable, the conference. Yeah, that's been going.
Unbelievable, the conference. You got to say it right. What if you put the question mark after conference?
Yeah, well, that would raise all kinds of questions.
Unbelievable,
about
the conference?
I think people wouldn't quite know whether it's on or not, would they? But
I think you should do a spin-off podcast called Inconceivable.
With a question mark?
Yeah, but
Inconceivable?
Yeah, the guy from, remember The Princess Bride?
Yeah.
Inconceivable.
Inconceivable.
Something like that.
Yeah, what's his name?
I forget.
What's his name? Interns.
Do your magic. Google.
All right. Oh, I have his laptop.
Yeah.
He can't. I'm using his laptop to record the audio this week. Oh, you got it? What's his name? Wallace. Sean Wallace. Wallace Sean? Mr. Bean. Wallace.
Didn't he just die
Bean.
recently?
No, he's not dead. Stop saying people are dead that aren't dead.
I think he's dead.
That's a horrible thing to do.
I'm going to beat
people.
the intern.
Wallace Sean. That's what I'm going with.
Hold on. Go. You keep your interview going. I'll do this.
You are the slowest interns I've ever seen. That's something my grandfather
You're
would
not
have
going to
said
get your Turkish delight when we're done.
So my great-grandfather was a radio host. He started a Christian conference. He didn't have a magazine, so he was almost as multimedia as you, but that was in the 1930s. Wallace Shawn, thank you.
Shaw.
Isn't
that right?
No, Sean. Because he's also the T-Rex in Toy Story.
Yes, he is.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that guy.
Yeah, you know, that guy.
He's kind of got quite a high-pitched voice, doesn't he?
Yes.
He's very whiny.
Great, now I have guilt. Yeah.
Inconceivable.
That's him. Okay. So let's get back. So once a month we have Caitlin Beatty on the show, and she's the editor of
Managing editor.
Yeah.
She's not the editor because there's someone else who's the editor.
She's the editor of the print edition, isn't that? She's the managing editor of Christianity Today, and she brings some stories from here's what's going on that we're looking at in the magazine. And I thought it'd be fun to do the same thing with our friend Justin from the other side of the pond to say what's going on in British Christianity and see what stories he's covering both on the podcast and in the magazine. So next month's cover is U2 because they're turning 100 years old.
Not quite, 40.
Well, they've been together for 40, but that means they're older than 40.
Yeah, I guess they must be. Well, I guess
60-ish.
they'd be late 50s because they were all teenagers.
I saw them last year in concert here in Chicago.
Yeah,
they don't move like they're in their 60s.
No,
or 50s.
Okay, well that's good, I guess.
Yeah,
although they may
spry.
regret it, like Prince, who he could hardly move when he was off stage because he was moving so much when he was on stage.
Yeah, but that's why he then had to take all the
painkillers.
Yeah. It's a dark story. Why'd you go there?
I don't know. I hope they're not taking painkillers.
They were all just in like secondary school when they got together as a band. So I wouldn't. They were probably like 15 years old or something.
They were very young. Actually, the concert was all built around their story, their origins.
Yeah. I saw that. I didn't get to go to it, but I'm a big fan of U2, and I saw their Paris concert, which got broadcast here in the UK.
So,
and just the thing they had, did they have that like big walkway thing? With all the videos going on, it's amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing.
Yeah, they always have been good at concert tech, like Pink Floyd, another band known for their concert tech.
What impressed me is there was a lot of concert tech, but the beginning of the show was super low key.
Really?
Like Bono just walked through the crowd and just got up on stage and started playing.
He wasn't hatched out of an egg.
There was no big
flown in by a T-Rex.
Pyrotechnics, nothing. It was
Pterodactyl?
just he just got up and started singing, and it was very low key.
Why is U2 news for Christianity magazine?
Well, I just felt like I had to have an excuse to have U2 on the front cover at some point in my editorship, and this was a good excuse, them turning 40 as a band. So we really just decided, let's chronicle 40 years of U2, how their faith has, been part of their songs over that time, how they've impacted the church. Actually, that's partly what the author of this article is.
Okay, well, give us a snippet of that. How has U2 impacted the church?
Well, I think they have genuinely had an impact on, obviously, issues around justice, and Bono has devoted much of his time certainly since the year 2000, when he got involved with the Make Poverty History campaign, to really zoning in on those kinds of issues, world poverty issues, social justice issues. And I think at the same time, we've seen a kind of a revival in the church in terms of addressing those kinds of issues. And I think that to a large degree, Bono has raised the consciousness, not only outside, but also within the church. And so, I think he did this tour back in the early 2000s where he visited a number of mega churches, Willow Creek and others, where he was spreading that message, especially around the issue of AIDS and the work that his organisation has done through that. So I think there's been the social dimension of what's happened. I would also suggest, and I don't know what people would make of this, but I've always said, isn't it a shame that we've never had anyone like C.S. Lewis in the 50 years since he died, because he was able to marry imagination with theology, with the popular culture in a way that no one else has done. And that may be true in literature, but I realised when I read this article, actually, you two have kind of been the C.S. Lewis of the music industry in many ways. And just as Lewis sort of hid his theology in plain sight in the Narnia stories, I think, you two have done that in their music.
Do you think, Bono, is obviously a fan. We interviewed the director of the film with Bono and Eugene Peterson. So he's a fan of Eugene Peterson. He's really inspired by the Psalms. Do you think he proactively drives after theology, or is it more just the water that he's kind of soaking in and it comes out just organically?
I think from what I can tell, he is attuned and looking to kind of get into those waters, if you like. I think he actively does the Bible study, looks for the material. He went out and wanted to read the message by Eugene Peterson, and obviously was inspired at some level by the way that put things across. So I think he's an active student of theology and the Bible. But I also think it's equally that their music was born into the faith that they had as teenagers when they joined that fellowship in Ireland where they grew up, and I think although their faith has, I'm sure, evolved and changed over the years, I think the central message of grace, redemption, hope that just informs their worldview has just naturally found its way into the music in one form or another, and some songs are obviously more explicit than others.
Right.
But I very rarely hear a track that doesn't at some level have a hint of the worldview that Bono inhabits, certainly. And so it seems as though it's an incredibly natural thing. It never feels forced.
Right.
It feels like it's just a very natural part of what he does and the way he brings things across.
Right. And do you think that the fact that they grew up, nowhere near, like in America, you grow up saying, this is Christian music, this is regular music, which one do you want to do?
Well, I think he makes this point in the article that it's quite possible that had U2 grown up in Nashville or wherever, they would have become CCM artists.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then they would have been very much firmly pigeonholed in a particular... But there was no CCM scene in Ireland at the point where they were birthed, and so they just had to sing the songs and do the rounds in the way that the other bands did it.
Right.
But they were brave enough to not hold back their beliefs in those songs, and so you get these amazing lyrics that you have, especially in their early work, which is very unapologetic in some sense about their faith. But
it's almost like they didn't. No one had told them yet that it's not cool. Because I mean, for people that are trying to break into the music business, I'm going to just throw in some references to the Bible.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
No one would do that here.
Exactly. And you wonder how they would go down if they were just appearing on the scene today.
Yeah.
You kind of get the feeling like, some Christian record label would snap them up and turn them into a Christian act. But that never happened, and then they've obviously resisted it ever happening since. I think one of the other keys is to their longevity and success is also just the fact that they have stuck together and done everything together and kind of grew up together. And that, I think, has obviously forged huge bonds between them as individuals. And in that sense, they were making it up as they went along. The Edge learned how to play guitar in the course of playing in U2. He invented that special sound he does by experimenting with an echo box at the age of 15 and whatever. And suddenly, a genre is born. So I just find that theirs is a fascinating story, and I continue to be so impressed that they still don't dumb down their faith, and they're willing to kind of put it on display.
So in the UK, are they are they considered to be outspoken public Christians in the UK, or are they just semi-mystical musicians that sometimes sound a little weird and churchy?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone... the people who are most aware of their Christian credentials are, of course, the Christians who are like us on the magazine, who love to bang on about it and say, hey, did you know they're Christians, everybody?
Yeah.
The reality is, I often meet people, who are simply not aware, haven't the faintest clue that they're Christian. And that's why I say their faith is hidden in plain sight, because it's not something that's sort of emblazoned on their album covers, and it's not,
Right.
But I think anyone who is a serious fan can't really miss the fact that it informs a lot of their thinking in their songs. But no, they're never, they're never introduced if they're on the radio as the Christian band U2. Obviously, they're simply the rock band U2 who have conquered the world.
Right.
All that being said, I think at the same time, Bono's status as a humanitarian and so on, sometimes people kind of roll their eyes and think, oh, here he is trying to be the Messiah again. And a little bit of that kind of slight weird... There's a little bit of, I suppose, a judgmental or cynical attitude sometimes towards that aspect of what they do.
But it's not necessarily because he claims to be a follower of Jesus. It's because, another rich white guy who thinks he can save the world.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where the cynicism comes from. It's less to do with their faith and more to do with their activism. And some people just think, it's a little bit too much. And they didn't do themselves any favors when they released Songs of Innocence, and everyone complained that they just forcibly had the album added to their iPod. But I think they learned from that one. So
yeah, we all learn. We live and we learn. Okay. The other big story that I wanted to get into was you just did a two-part, like a 2-hour interview, 3-hour interview with Darren Brown.
Yeah, it was actually about 90 minutes is what it totaled to.
Oh, okay.
But I kind of split it across 2 episodes of Unbelievable and added a bit of padding and hey presto.
So background. Darren Brown is... I'm trying to think of the equivalent in the U.S. Major illusionist. Oh, he's a mentalist. He's not technically... He doesn't saw women in half.
No. I mean, maybe David Blaine might be an equivalent name in the US. David Copperfield is more of a showman probably than the kind that you'd find at Las Vegas than Darren Brown is. Darren Brown's thing here in the UK is very much he can appear to do mind control, and he can appear to... He's done loads of TV specials that have been broadcast here where he's made all kinds of amazing things happen. Convinced someone that they're actually they've woken up in a nuclear devastated Holocaust wasteland, and
so he's been to Winnipeg, obviously,
or through a series of suggestive things, managed to, in the course of one evening, persuade someone to push someone off a building to their death, and these sorts of things. It's quite
fun,
extraordinary stuff. But a lot of it is about our suggestibility, the way we can be, made to do things, and the way he does that. So it's a mixture of illusion and what he sees as this sort of ways to control people.
So he does not play up any sort of mystical, magical, spiritual side to this. He's outspoken that this is simply utilizing psychological realities that can be manipulated in our mind. And it's a purely naturalistic approach.
Absolutely, and on that level, he is, quite a self-proclaimed atheist, and so maybe a bit like Penn and Teller. They sort of use their stuff, don't they, to kind of sometimes rag on religion. And there's a sort of an element in his TV shows and stage shows where there's a very strong kind of skeptical sort of.
So he did a was it one special or a series of specials where he trained someone to go to the U.S. and be a faith healer?
That's right. This was a few years ago now, but in a sense, he's been able to use a few times the fact that he's relatively anonymous in the U.S. to be able to do these specials, and then he comes back and broadcasts them here in the UK. But
and then you all laugh at us. All of the UK, just, those silly Americans.
Silly Yanks.
No, but, I mean, with the stuff he does, anyone would be taken in, I think. And what, in this instance, it was called Miracles for Sale, and he was able to select the right volunteer from a number of people who volunteered in the UK and take someone out. And by teaching him the tricks of the trade, as it were, he was able to pass him off as a faith healer, a Christian faith healer, and even set up this kind of event where people came and he was this chap was able to perform miracles and so on. And this is the theme that very much gets developed in his latest stage show, which just recently ended its run here.
Yeah, in the UK. Describe that. Describe the new show, because this is what you talked to him about in great depth.
Yeah, absolutely. So the show is called Miracle, and it ran for about a year and a half actually in the UK to sell out crowds. And essentially, the first half is fairly standard Darren Brown stuff. It's still amazing, but it's kind of, reading people's minds and doing crazy stuff with persuading someone to come up from the audience and eat shards of glass from a light bulb and all this kind of stuff that he does, apparently fairly easily. Then it changes gear in the second half, and he adopts the persona of a sort of healing televangelist. And the thing with Darren Brown is he actually was a Christian at one time. He grew up going to a church. He had a faith. In fact, he was involved in some fairly charismatic churches as a young man before he lost his faith in his early 20s. And so he kind of has seen the stuff that happens, and he is able, in an extraordinary way, to quite effectively replicate it on stage. And I'm giving spoilers here if anyone ends up watching the TV special, but so I should warn you that. But he kind of, what he does in the stage show, and I was there, was he leads the audience through a kind of an exercise that helps to kind of flood them with feel-good emotions. And then he calls people up to the stage and starts to invite people, if they feel they've any kind of pain has left their body, if anything's happened to them, they come and they're able to go on stage and they will testify to various ailments that have left. But more than that, he will tell them what has been healed in their body, and they'll testify, yes, that's happened. And then he'll call out, in the audience, things that are being healed, and people will put their hand up and say, yes, I just feel I've been healed of that. And then there are other crazy things that happen. And he often ends by touching someone on the head and boom, down they go, as though they've been slain in the spirit. And for him, in the interview that I had with him after the show, he said, it's all about creating an adrenaline rush, essentially. Adrenaline kills pain. And so it gives basically this temporary pain relief so that people, there was a guy who came up on stage, he said he'd got this sprained ankle, but he was able to walk on it perfectly fine now, it was fine. And what he says is, that guy's ankle is still sprained. He'll just, the pain will come back once the adrenaline wears off. And his view is that that's what's happening in these miracle rallies and healing rallies that happen. So it was a fascinating conversation.
It seems a little crazy that these people would testify to these experiences when they bought a ticket to come to a show that they know is a farce.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the kind of weird thing about it is he's very clear from the outset, you're not being miraculously healed. He doesn't say exactly what is happening.
Yeah.
But people come up, and these are, generally probably quite skeptical people. They're Darren Brown fans, but they'll come up and they'll say, it's amazing, I feel like my... And he said, actually, in the interview, interestingly, that in the vast majority of cases, people's aches and pains come back. But there are some people, one person at least, who's been in the show says, my life has been changed forever because of what happened that night.
The healing that
atheist
experienced
healer.
From the atheist faith healer.
And would he attribute that to just a placebo effect?
I think he would say that when someone does testify to something that seems to be a kind of a long-term effect, more often the change has been in the psychological approach or view that person has of the thing they were experiencing. And so something changes in the mind, which then changes their attitude to whether I can live with this thing or whatever. I mean, his view is that there's never been any provable case where a physical change has happened. A limb has grown back, or an organ has in a moment, been repaired or whatever. Now, I try to challenge him a little bit. I do know of stories where people do claim that fairly physical things have happened and had long-term effects. And in particular, I raised the story I have of a friend of mine, Alex, who went on a mission trip to Peru, and to a small kind of mountainside church with a small group of people in this mission. And the night before, he and a girl he was praying with had prayed that they would see someone raised from the dead, and an eyeball grow back into someone's socket. They went to the church. Well, no one was dead to be raised, but they did pray for a man who had a missing eyeball. And he says he had his hand on this man's head, and as he was praying, he started to feel something move underneath. And as he drew it away, where there had once been scarred skin across this eyeball socket, there was an eyeball had started to appear and to move around. And by the end of this service, the man had a fully functioning eyeball and was able to testify that. So that I thought pretty interesting story.
And obviously, I'm sure Darren looked at that a little bit skeptically.
Well, he said that's really interesting, and he said, he said, to his credit, I don't doubt that I don't think your friend is lying. I don't think, and this friend I can vouch for, and they're not a fantasist. And in fact, if anything, their theological position tends to militate against miracles in some way. But but he said, the thing he said was, we often misremember things. And this was 15 years ago. And he's got his memory of it. But Darren basically told this story to me of, I remember as a young man seeing a magician do this amazing trick where he pushed a lit cigarette through a jumper and out the other side, and there was no damage to the jumper. And he said he met that magician several years later and said, I've never worked out how you did that trick. I've seen the more usual trick, which is just pushing a lit cigarette into a jumper and making it disappear, but I don't know how you managed to make it go through the jumper. And his magician said, well, you misremember that trick because I just did the normal pushing it into the jumper and making it disappear. But Darren says, I had a very specific memory of it going through the jumper and out the other side, but I was mistaken. And so his view is there will always be a naturalistic explanation for these. And if the naturalistic explanation is simply you misremembered what happened, that's the most likely.
So how did your 90-minute interaction with him and going to his show, in what ways did that affect your thinking about the kind of experiences that you'll hear, people in some Christian traditions claim to have?
Well, I believe in miracles, and I'm what's sometimes referred to as a charismatic with the seatbelt on. But so in a sense, I've been in those meetings, and I've seen that stuff happen. I was certainly challenged, and it made me realise that, yes, we need to be very wary of crowd dynamics, what's going on.
Yeah.
And probably, we are too credulous very often as Christians to immediately ascribe healing to situations where maybe there is a placebo effect going on, an adrenaline rush or whatever.
Right.
And we shouldn't declare healings and miracles until we have validated that there is some kind of a long-term effect going on. So I think it's a good thing that Darren's making us be more judicious and be more aware of some of our willingness sometimes to be too credulous.
So you've had Peter Boghossian on your show.
Yeah.
And I gave a talk at his class at Portland State University on his atheism class, Atheism 101. And I discovered that because I basically took the approach of explaining to the class, here's why I am a Christian. Here's why I believe, and there were 3 or 4 major bullet points. One of them was things where I'd seen God show up, in miraculous ways. Some of those were healing. And I discovered that afterwards at the Q&A period, the only thing people wanted to talk about was disputing the healing cases. Like, that could have been this could have been that. How do you know it wasn't that? And there was so much that ruffled people's feathers so much that it almost made me wonder if it just wasn't worth bringing up, because they ignored everything else that I talked about. Do you find that the case where these kind of miraculous claims, where skeptics are so concerned that the gullible are being manipulated, that it's almost not worth it?
Yeah, I do. Whenever I do the issue on the show, because we do the kind of hard end kind of philosophical apologetics, but we also sometimes get into doing that stuff about do miracles happen, and I get actually pushback both from atheists and from Christians actually when I do that, because there are atheists who say, I can't believe you'd lower yourself to all that showmanship rubbish, Justin, far below your standards, and then there are Christians who will equally say, well, this is the problem, it all gets very kooky when you get to the miraculous, and let's just keep it to good old doctrine and apologetics and not involve any of this wacky faith stuff.
Right. Let's stay post-enlightenment with our Christianity.
I feel like you're kind of then cutting yourself off from a massive swathe of the Christian experience.
Yeah.
And frankly, what appears to be the case in the Gospels, where the miraculous is expected, happens, and is part of the supernatural reality. Certainly, I think that there are inevitably, and Darren makes a big deal of this in the show, that there are hucksters and tricksters out there and people who are doing it for money and all the rest of it. Of course, that exists. But that's not most of the experiences I know, the people I know who make claim to healing. It was not in some glitzy, traveling evangelist kind of thing. It was in a quiet sort of environment. It was very non-hyped up type of place, and I just know too many people and stories who have seen a healing that just does seem to defy a naturalistic explanation, for it to all be down to misremembering or people being tricked or whatever.
But you can't prove it.
No, and that's the frustrating thing. Mm-hmm. If you look for a kind of cast iron miracle that any atheist would be hard pressed to offer any other kind of solution for, you will be scratching around. They are very hard to come by, and I've heard various reasons given why that is. Often doctors aren't sometimes that happy about releasing things that contradict earlier diagnoses, for instance, is something I've heard. I've heard that the fact is a lot of these miraculous things happen in places where you don't have access to rigorous medical testing before and after and that sort of thing.
Right.
These may all just be excuses as far as the atheist is concerned, and one of the most frequent things I hear is, well, now we live in the age of the smartphone. We should be seeing miracles all the time because everyone's got a camera on them. And I don't know. I mean, there are people out there who are doing interesting work in this area. Craig Keener had a big 2-volume book on the case for miracles, where he details in quite some length a number of what he believes are credible miracle stories from around the world. There are others who are doing similar work and starting to compile what they think are fairly rigorous cases where there is evidence for miraculous healing.
Okay. What have you, in your, the last couple of years of interactions with skeptics, where have you actually seen people moved? Because it doesn't seem to tend to be the purely intellectual stuff. Where do you actually say, oh, wow, I think positions have shifted slightly in this conversation?
Yeah, I think apologetics isn't where, if I'm honest, like conversion happens.
Yeah.
Apologetics, I think it can be important for helping to remove people's doubts or remove particular objections. But I often find that it tends to also attract, in terms of the people I hear from, the more hardened skeptic, who you're inevitably, it's going to be a longer road for them if they're ever to come to faith. But I still think it's worth doing, because actually there are many people for whom I think at some point in the journey, once an objection has been removed, it does clear the way for them to walk towards Christ and to have an experience of faith. I'm not one of those people who believe you can be argued into the kingdom. And so I've always believed there has to be a kind of a will, there has to be something in the heart that wants God, for someone to move towards God. You will always be able to find another objection.
Right.
You will never have a cast iron argument for God or for Christianity. You can always find an objection. So in that sense, I never expect apologetics to take people there. But when people do get in touch for whom Unbelievable, the show, has at some level been part of their journey towards faith, it's very often been one, brick, one cog in the process.
Yeah.
And there have been all kinds of other relationships and things going on that have also been part of that process towards faith. And don't get me wrong, there are people who write in and say, "Oh, your show confirmed my atheism," or "Your show, has I was doubting Christianity, and your show just made me believe that even more." Because at the end of the day, people will kind of hear what they want to hear when you've got two guests. And you two people listening to the same show can walk away with completely different views about who won.
So what are you doing the show and doing the conferences? What do you hope to accomplish, and how do you know if you've accomplished it?
It's a really good question. I think all I'm wanting to do with the show is to have a genuine kind of dialogue where people will hear Christians and non-Christians having that kind of an interaction, which is actually unfortunately fairly rare these days, where they're willing to listen and open up to each other. And that alone can break down all kinds of barriers, because I think people come with intellectual barriers to Christianity, but actually they also come believing that Christians are dishonest and unwilling to have these kinds of dialogues. And when they actually discover, doing the Darren Brown interviews, I think we'll have reached a whole new group of people, because he posted that on his Twitter and Facebook, and I'm hoping people will just see that you may listen to the show and think, oh well, Darren was right, Christianity's a load of rubbish. But I hope that in the interaction they heard, they'll realise Christians themselves are not these ignorant, small-minded people.
Right.
And even that is for me a win, even if it doesn't see the atheist, come through in the end.
Do you ever get criticized by Christians in your audience for giving an equal platform to skeptics, to atheists, to those who are antagonistic to the faith, because you may actually be harming the faith of somebody who's listening to the program?
People do write in sometimes who are worried about that, and I think that's the danger, isn't it? Like you've said before, I think, Phil, it's not necessarily safe for all the family, and so it's a gamble, and especially in the early days of the show. I think I've said last time I was on it, we got letters and emails from people saying, why are you letting all these atheists on my Christian radio station? I think for me, it's a risk that's worth taking almost, because in the long run, anyone who listens to the show over an extended period of time, they're going to see that there's something in this Christianity stuff. And if there's a sort of a Christian who's somewhat confused or weak in their faith, they may hear things that are discomforting or challenging, but we live in an age where you're going to get that anyway. You're only a click on Google away from seeing these objections. So I'd rather they heard them in the context of someone who's also willing to put the other side as well.
Right.
And sometimes, I could have maybe interviewing Darren Brown, and he's going to challenge someone because they're going to think, he's got a point about all that stuff about adrenaline and stuff and the miracle rallies. Well, maybe we need to hear that. If he's got a point, he's got a point. So let's just face up to that and let's ask, well, how do we address that?
Right.
That's a value that I'm encouraged to see you're following. I think it's a rare minority point of view in American Christianity. I think the value of safety is such a huge piece of American Christianity that the thought of opening up a dialogue in a public setting like a radio station with an atheist week after week after week would be too disturbing for people.
Risky.
Way too risky.
You don't have enough insurance coverage. What? Because someone loses their faith. Someone's kid loses their faith. You get sued. Do you have a policy that has a rider for that?
When I was a teenager, though, a program like Unbelievable would have been exactly what I needed.
Yeah.
Because I was a highly skeptical teenager, and I had an inclination toward faith. But in the little world I occupied at the time, I didn't know that there were any thoughtful, intellectual Christians. And so there was no credibility. Yeah. And just listening to that program week after week after week, even when I feel like the atheist or the non-believer is making a stronger point, with regularity, most of the time the Christians you have in the program are incredibly thoughtful, smart, intelligent people. And it would have given me a view that you can actually be thoughtful and be a Christian, even if they didn't win every argument.
Right.
And that's what a lot of people, I think, doubt nowadays, is that you can be thoughtful and intellectual as a Christian and also not be a jerk.
I think for me, it's about not that there is a place for, and we do that at the conference in a sense, the where it's just the one side and you do hear the kind of the arguments laid out and the apologetics. But in a sense, that's not how real life happens.
Right.
When you have the conversation with the skeptic, you're going to get all these responses, and you can't necessarily just roll out your 5 arguments for God. It will go off in different directions, and they'll say things you never thought of. But I think the value of listening to conversations, especially as you say, that regularity is it's not just that you pick up, hey, here's a good response to that argument. It's actually, I don't need to be scared. I don't need to, there's a sense in which, I've heard this before, and no, there's no need to kind of run away and be worried about this. I think it almost builds a kind of a sort of a thick skin when you do these kinds of engagements. And so I remember early on in the show, there were things that when I'd come across something that was novel for me, a new argument against faith or something, it would be like, oh, that is a good point. How am I going to... This is a bit uncomfortable. Now I hear the same things. I think, oh, that kind of fits that box and that box, and
right.
And you end up just being more confident, frankly, in having those conversations. And for me, that's a good thing. Even if you go through, it's sort of there's an uncomfortable period getting to that point.
Right.
And I think it's still good that we still get challenged as well, because then it means you're actually still thinking about it and trying to process it.
And it does, for me, because I listened to quite a bit of your show. Unbelievable.
Ding.
Where's your bell? Okay. And it gave me, it's kind of like holding up the intellectual robustness of your own faith in the mirror and getting an accurate look at it. Because you start to hear, because you've got I read Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, when I was in high school, and I thought, well, there you go. There you go. There's no good response. And then you start listening to, real engaging skeptics, like, oh, okay, there is a good response to that. And oh, he's got a good response to that too. Okay, do I feel confident in what I'm hanging my faith on, now that I know that it's not as simple as it was made out to be, and you realize you really do have to push through an inherited faith or a kind of simplistically argued faith to a real personal faith. It can't just be about arguments and intellectual stuff, because someone will give you things you haven't thought of before. And what it falls back to is, yes, but I've had a real personal experience with Christ. I can't show it to you on my iPhone because it doesn't show up on camera. But that's, for me, that when there's a close call, that's what wins the argument every time, is I have personal experience with this faith. And I've had, a few atheists say, well, why don't you do the Skeptics experiment where you try believing every world religion, for a month and then see if you still want to be a Christian. And I, one of them, I just said, well, I couldn't do that because I don't believe they're true. I can't falsify assent to something. Yeah. And they said, exactly, and that's why we can't just pretend Christianity is true and try that out. And we both agreed. Okay, so unless something radical changes in your thinking, you're going to remain an atheist. And unless something radical changes in my thinking, I'm going to remain a Christian. And then we're at peace. Good on you. Great. Okay, last thing, and then we'll let you go because it's getting late there and it's past your bedtime. Great British Christian thinkers. Start with Chesterton, Lewis, and today we've got Lennox and others. They're getting old.
Some of them are dead.
Some of them are dead. N.T. Wright, they're getting old. Who is there a next generation coming, or are we in trouble?
I think, in a sense, that there's always a next generation coming. And to be honest, did you know about N.T. Wright when he was in his 20s? Probably not.
No, I didn't.
It's just that they take a while, I guess, to rise through the ranks sometimes.
Like good wine.
No, I'm very encouraged, actually, because because of what I do, I tend to engage with a lot of younger end apologists, people who are just coming through university, PhD level, that kind of thing. And I'm very encouraged, actually, in the UK scene that apologetics, as much as it's not the be-all and end-all of what will save the church in the UK, there is nonetheless a kind of a rising sort of young, sort of organic network of young people, male and female actually, interested in pursuing apologetics and making a rational case for faith. And I think they're the people to look out for. I think they're the people, most importantly, who know what the current generation is experiencing. And
right.
In a way, the fact that apologetics kind of can't be the same as it was maybe when Josh McDowell was publishing his books.
Right.
It's got to change a bit to meet the kind of skepticism that people are experiencing today. So yeah, there's a number of young, bright, potential, Lennoxes and McGraths and everything else coming through the ranks. And part of the joy, actually, of Unbelievable is being able to occasionally let them cut their teeth in those sorts of environments and bring them through and sort of introduce new people to the audience.
Okay. Do you think that would it be harder for a Bible-believing, a very, explicitly Bible-believing Christian like a John Lennox to end up a well-respected professor at Oxford or Cambridge?
Oh yeah, no, I think so. I think that you are seeing that anyway happen with various different people. So I know, I guess very evangelical Christians who certainly in philosophy and all kinds of areas actually are rising through the ranks. So I don't see any problem on that front.
Okay.
I think that in any case, the new atheism thing is a little bit run its course now here in the UK.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of, people have got a bit weary of it. The main problem is what it always has been, really. It's apathy in the UK. I think, if anything, new atheism kind of was a good thing for Christianity. It has been a good thing. It's made people actually sit up and start debating it. I wouldn't have half the debates on my show if it weren't for the new atheists. The harder thing is when people just switch off altogether. And I think we've got a lot of young talented apologists coming through the ranks, and as long as there's people for them to interact with, we should have some good times ahead.
Okay, cool. So is there hope for the British church? Is it?
There is. I think I was out in the US over the summer. I did the East Coast and the West Coast, New York and LA. Did an unbelievable event actually out in LA, which you can hear on a recent edition of the show if you go. But I was asked this question by a number of different people, because I think sometimes you guys think, it's all heading into a mass extinction in the UK. At one level, obviously the overall numbers are about decline in UK churchgoing and have been for several decades. But what I see on the ground is actually lots of really interesting stuff happening at a grassroots level. Particularly some church networks where they're seeing, I think, something like a revival happening in some ways. So HTB, Holy Trinity Brompton, who have been planting and revitalising churches all around the UK, is one particular story I could point you to. They're the guys behind the Alpha course. I think you probably have that over in the USA as well. And people like that. And so I think there's lots of reasons to be hopeful. I think sometimes you have to kind of shed the layers of a previous generation where faith became inherited and nominal.
Right.
And then you build again. And I think we've seen that before in British history. We haven't always enjoyed some long golden era. There were times when faith shrank away and then revived again. And who knows, maybe that's around the corner.
Well, Justin, we appreciate your continued efforts in keeping the conversation going.
Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to N.T. Wright. He's coming on your show, right?
We haven't announced it yet, but maybe.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
We kind of have.
We kind of did?
I let it slip in a Twitter
Oh, you
thing.
did? Oh, okay.
Yeah, next
month.
month.
Looks like he'll be on the show next month. Yeah, that'll be fun. All right, I got to summarize everything we just said. Thanks, everybody, for listening to Justin Brierley and his christening of his show and his magazine and everything he's teaching us, because it's so keen to learn more about healing and are the people that practice it stealing, and is it adrenaline or the Holy Spirit? Well, maybe a little of both. Let's hear it. And we've got new apologists in the UK coming, so I'll keep my ukulele strumming, and there's lots more that we can be humming about. All right, thanks, Justin.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Check out
Justin
Brierley's show, Unbelievable, going up at the end on iTunes, and we will see. Oh, also this Wednesday night, we're doing the Wednesday night. What's the date? Jason? 21st, Wednesday night, the 21st, we're doing a live stream with me and Sky, this one.
I'll be here.
And and go to patreon.com/Phil Vischer so you can support us, and then we can keep lofting expensive gifts at our guests, like the one Justin Brierley will no doubt get in the mail any day now. See you next week.
The Phil Vischer Podcast is produced by Phil Vischer Enterprises and recorded live at Jellyfish Lab Studios. This episode was edited by Jason Rugg and was fact-checked by absolutely no one. For more information, go to philvischer.com.